Hi, this is the first in a series of video tutorials that will cover the creation of this dumpster current generation game asset. I'll demonstrate the whole production pipeline over the series, where we'll start in this video with the low poly modeling, then the unwrap. Then we'll create high poly models and cages to export into XNormal for texture map baking. Then we'll use Quixel Dedo to create PBR ready materials and explore look development. Then Photoshop for further texture detailing. And finally we'll assemble within Unity. It's a lot to cover, but it will be a lot of fun, and it will make a pretty cool asset at the end of it. So let's get into it. Now the first thing I want to do is just set up my grid. I just want to make sure that the scale is appropriate. So I've set up to make sure that Maya is set into centimeters for units. Now, just quickly, if I create a cube, in this case 1 by 1, that should be 1 centimeter cubed. So I've just snapped that to the center of the world. Now if I set it to 100 by 100, for example, what we're looking at is a 1 meter by 1 meter cube once we bring it into the game. So we want to make sure that we're working at a correct scale and our final asset isn't gigantic or tiny. Now the next thing I'm doing is setting my grid options. It's quite useful to see this at so it's large enough, so if it's 100 squared units wide. I like to set the grid lines every 10, in this case 5 subdivisions. And I also like to change the color of the grid lines, and so you can see what that does. It shows me every unit, which is exactly 1 centimeter squared. And with those blue lines, I know that every 5 grid lines is 5 centimeters. And so all up, I have this 100 centimeter cube. And we can see that if we count that, goes out to 10. Okay, so now I'll just set this up to pretty much the proportions of the dumpster that I'm wanting to make. So I know that just by looking at some quick specs of actual dumpsters online, a quick bit of research shows me that they're typically about 2 meters wide, 1 meter high at the front, and they extend a little bit at the back, so they have a slanting front section. So I'm using the modeling toolkit here with the multi-cut tool. If I hold down Control, that gives me an insert edge loop. And if I also hold down Shift, so Shift and Control, that gives me snaps the edge loop to the center or to what snap settings that I've set. And obviously I've deleted the other side. I'm duplicating special with instance and flipping the X in the negative space, which gives me a perfect mirror. So the advantage of duplicating that as an instance is as I change one, it automatically updates the other side. With your multi-cut tool, if you go into an orthographic view, hold down Shift and click from just outside of the model and click and drag straight up or straight to the side. That will cut straight through all of the faces in your view. So just inserting some edge loops here so that I can extrude out this side section. So really this process is pretty straightforward. I'm trying to make a very low poly optimized model. Early on, we're more or less trying to keep it in quads. You always want to keep things simple, so it's easy to work with. Now I've just extruded this right back because we want this to flow through. I'm just deleting the back face there, and I just need to reconnect this up. So what I'm doing is grabbing those edges. And I'll just jump into the side view and align this up. Now I will extrude those edges. So there I just tried to use the modeling toolkit extrude. It doesn't seem to work super well with edges selected, so I've just used the conventional edge extrusion. Back to the modeling toolkit, I'm using its target weld to just weld those verts back together. It's always worth double checking that all your verts are merged, and we can see here there's a collection, there's 24 verts. We shouldn't have that many. So I've just selected them all and using my merge vertex tool, just collapsing those. You often need to increase the threshold a little bit just to make sure that they all collapse. So moving on, we'll do the top section where the lid connects. So I've just extruded the top face. I'm just aligning them now. And selecting these top verts faces, I just want to extrude those out. They've come out a bit misaligned, so I'll just quickly, in the top view, grab these verts and scale them together. By scaling, they stay symmetrical when I move them, instead of individually moving them and just sort of eyeballing that they're aligned properly. Now here I'm extruding in this top section because I want to create essentially a bevel. I could have actually beveled it, but extruding and scaling in works just as well. And now I've done a second extrude to bring it down to create the inside section of the bin. Now in this video tutorial we won't actually use, the finished product won't be using the inside section of the bin, but I want to set it up. You never know how you might want to use a game asset down the track, or how someone else may end up using it. So with this sort of asset, it just seems really straightforward to make sure that there is an inside section the lids can open and close if we wanted that to happen. Just making some adjustments. The walls of the bin were probably a little thin, so just bringing those in. Just a little bit of cleanup. Just making sure everything is aligned nicely. Creating the lid now, so I've just started with the face, and I've snapped those verts to align with the slope of the top of the bin, and I'm just moving the face up, and I just want to make sure that this does correctly align, so we'll just snap those verts. Okay, so selecting that face and extruding it up gives me the base shape for the lid. So using the multi-cut tool to insert edge loop, if I set the snap settings to 20, that'll snap when I hold down shift at 20% along that edge. Now if I set that to 50, I can snap it in the exact center of the remainder. I'm double clicking on each edge loop to select the whole ring, and then beveling because I want to create a gap in these faces. I extrude them up, and what I want to do is scale them in, but if I just scale them like this, they'll collapse into each other. So I need to use transform components. I come down to my local X and Z, and that lets me scale those faces locally. And I actually only want to scale them in the X. Now I can just manually scale Selecting these back faces, I'm using the edge slide tool, which just lets me bring them forwards while maintaining the same angle of the face that edge loop is sitting on. Now I'm just trying to adjust the base of the lid to make sure it aligns. Problem is the base section of the dumpster is not aligned properly at the top there, so we'll just adjust these verts. And we can realign the verts from the lid. The back section probably should lean forward a little bit, not be perfectly aligned. So I'm creating a cylinder here. Always think about the resolution of your game assets. So here I'm bringing this down to a fairly low standard. You don't need to go too low with rounded curved objects with cylinders. Usually somewhere around 10 or 12 faces will divisions will be fine. Now I've deleted that inside edge because I was planning on making this one piece, but I will later actually rebuild that because, like I said earlier, I want the faces, the lids to be able to open and close. This back cylinder, I've just set the normals to soften edges just to help it look rounded. So I'm extruding out the end piece because we'll use that to create the section that connects to the main bin. What I'll do for that is select a couple of faces, extrude them out, and reshape them. So there's really nothing to this. I'm just simply extruding a couple of sections and making adjustments as I feel is appropriate based on my reference photos. Just making sure it all aligns nicely. And we can delete these bottom faces. Any faces that won't be seen in game, always delete. There's no point having geometry that doesn't serve to increase the quality of the asset. Likewise, once you start to clean up an asset, get rid of any edge loops that aren't assisting it. I'm just going to save. Always incremental save. Disk space is cheap. Just keep on going save as and add a new version, file version. If you have any issues with corruption, you at least have an earlier version you can go back to. If you have issues with a big misguided process in modeling, you can at least have a earlier version that you can go back to before you made significant changes, which can be quite useful. So here obviously I've just made a cube. This is going to be the base section that the wheel attaches to. For the wheel, I'm making a cylinder and reducing its subdivisions to a level that I'm happy with. 14 is fine. We're going for a fairly high-end asset, so we don't need to get too low poly. But this is just a wheel. It will be duplicated 4 times, and it's not like someone's really going to walk right up to this tiny little section of this asset and study it closely, so we don't need to get too high poly with it. Delete half of the model just so I can duplicate rather than having to build 2 identical halves. It's much easier just to duplicate it. Snap the center pivot point to the outside edge before you duplicate. Merge, combine the two objects, merge your vertices. Creating a cylinder, so this is the axle that the wheel sits on. Aligning that in the front view and scaling it so it's wide enough. Now in the top view I'm creating a cube, so this will be the supporting struts that the wheel attaches to. No need to make anything this small very complex. So I'm softening the edges of that cylinder to help it look all rounded. We want the outside edges of these sorts of shapes to be hard edge, and we want the inside edges to be soften edged. The wheel was just a bit close to the top there, so I've brought it down and extruded up, brought up the verts. So once again, we'll make an incremental save. And we're pretty close to having finished this modeling part of the project. Just a few more pieces. I'm making some adjustments to the intersection. We could use a bit more detail on this model. We can certainly afford some more polygons. And so what I want to do is bevel some edges. So I'm just selecting all of the edge loops that I want to bevel. You need to make sure all of the ones that will be beveled are selected. Now click on bevel. And I'm not actually adjusting the bevel, that's pretty good size. And it definitely gives a nicer look to the model without substantially increasing the poly count. Because this is duplicated, we'll delete those inside faces. I've got an edge loop around there, we'll just get rid of that. Okay, so if we look at the reference photos, they have these sections that allow the lid to be locked. It's just a few extra pipes and bars. The other thing is the lids have a gap between them. They're not perfectly aligned. So I'll do the gap section first. Basically, I'll just jump into the top view, having selected all of the top verts of the lid, and I can just move those to the side. So that gives me a little extrusion on the edge. When we duplicate those over, it's much more convincing looking dumpster lid. Also like a small extrusion on the outside of it. Okay, snap the center pivot to the middle and duplicate to make sure it looks good. Now I've created a cylinder here, so this is for the locking mechanism. So I'll just select the faces and extrude them out in the correct direction. Just a little bit of scaling and rotation to try to get those to align nicely. No need to worry too much about the shape of that at the moment. I'll clean that up shortly. Now jumping into the right view, I'm going to make a cylinder as a reference, which is what I mean by cleaning it up. With this cylinder here, I can position the verts around the shape of that cylinder. So this cylinder will become the front bar for the sort of locking mechanism of the dumpster. So just stretching that, making sure it's the correct length. So we can see that's needs to be brought out a little bit. I'll just grab those verts and also bring those out so it all connects. Yep, that's looking better. Now, snapping the pivot to the middle of this cylinder section lets me rotate it without changing its position. So this lid, this bar, so I'll just bring it down a little. So I just want to rotate this and make sure it's about the appropriate length. That definitely looks better and is more similar to the reference. Now I want to create a small kind of pipe on the side of the bin, which is what a chain will connect to. And I will actually make a small chain hanging off it later for a bit of extra detail. So what I've done is create this curve and just a cylinder. I'll select the faces on this cylinder, shift select the curve, and then use the extrude face options. Extruding to the selected curve, which extrudes it out by the number of set divisions. So I'll speed this section up. It's pretty straightforward. I'm just making some adjustments to this curve, inserting a new edge loop. I just want to make sure that I'm happy with the general roundness of it. So, minor adjustments, but just want to make sure that it's fairly clean. Scaling it down and positioning it where it needs to be. Now, if we look at the reference, there's a section that comes out of the bin that allows the rotating handle section to connect and be locked. So if I rotate this up, I need to get the angle right. So grab those verts and move them up. And I'm just going to select these faces at the base here, extrude those out. Just extrude out this cylinder to get a bit of extra detail. Just make sure I've only got those outside faces selected. Just softening those edges to help it look rounded on that cylinder. We'll just scale out these verts, make sure that's aligned correctly, but I've missed a couple of verts there in my selection, so I'll just redo that. Here I'm just inserting an edge loop in the center because I want to delete half of the model so that I can just duplicate the whole thing rather than having to rebuild all of this on the other side of the model. Now I'm inserting some edge loops here because I want to create a hole inside it. So by inserting 3 edge loops, that gives me 6 verts on the inside, which will allow me to make a cylindrical shape. So I'm just quickly selecting the inside section and then deselecting the bits I don't want. And deselecting the other side. So I've only got the inside section of this one side selected. Extrude those over. And then just select all of the verts and merge components. Just keeping an eye on your poly count on specifically on the verts that you have selected when you run a merge to make sure that you are actually reducing and merging your verts. If they're not merging, you'll need to adjust your threshold. Now at the moment, I'm just quickly making some manual adjustments to the shape. I'm reducing some of the poly count by using the target weld there. Now if I make a cylinder, this can be a reference for the cylindrical shape that I'm looking for. So jumping into the side view, I can just manually align these verts with that cylinder. Also using this cylinder just to reposition the end of this shape, make sure it's nice and rounded and it's a little bit more nicely aligned. Here I've aligned this vertically. Just going to use this reference cylinder once again to align this top section. I've inserted an edge loop just to give me a bit more resolution there, a few more edges to make sure I can get that top bit nice and round. Just using the multi-cut tool there to draw in a connection, which gives me a new division there at the top. So now that's nice and round. Can bring up those edge loops at the bottom and make some more adjustments there to keep it aligned nicely. And I can just delete this cylinder. So now that that's all nicely aligned, we can just rotate that back into position. Just adjusting this central cylinder. Just a few minor tweaks there to make sure I'm happy with the general shape. Duplicating this model, deleting the faces, just so I have the end bit only. And you can see there I've got 2 copies of that now. So I'm moving that in, and this section basically will become the locking mechanism that extrudes out of the main section of the dumpster. So we can rotate that top section down, and that gives us the shape that we're after for this sort of locking handle design. I'll just snap the pivot point to the middle, duplicate that over and flip it in the scale X. Merge those verts, delete the edge loop in the middle, delete history, save the scene. Now just duplicating over this section. Same with this loop, we'll just delete its history, duplicate it over. If I snap the center pivot point to the middle of the dumpster before I duplicate it, and then scale X, that flips it pretty closely to where it should be. And that's pretty much the finished dumpster, low poly model. That's ready to be unwrapped now, as in our next video.